We have now considered in some detail both the pacifist and the just war traditions. Another Christian tradition with which you should be familiar is what I'll be calling the Crusade tradition. We will not spend nearly as much time looking at it because, quite frankly, almost no one, at least no one among Christian ethical scholars, defends the Crusade tradition anymore. And very few people actually refer to it in trying to discern our responsibilities in the context of political conflict. Still, you should know about it because it has shaped Christian history and Christian activity in the context of political conflict. In February of 2015, President Obama at the National Prayer Breakfast referred to the history of Christian crusading, comments that were quite controversial. You should at least have some idea about what he was speaking of. The Crusade tradition in Christian reflection on war has four basic characteristics. First, it tends to interpret some wars as sanctioned by God for religious purposes or religious reasons. So the Crusade tradition sees some wars as having very little to do with traditional politics, with the conflicts between political authorities or peoples over political control or over economic resources. Rather, the Crusade tradition sees the root of some conflict as religious, and therefore war within that context has religious motives and is seen as sanctioned by God. As such, and this points to its second characteristic, it tends to see war as conflict between absolute good, those on God's side, and absolute evil, those who have made themselves the enemies of God. You can see here the contrast between the Crusade perspective and that of just war theory, which recognizes that all the participants in war are sinners, though some have a justified cause for war and others do not. When a war is seen as a crusade, fighting it is an act of religious devotion. It's not purely a moral endeavor, just as it's not purely a political endeavor. It's now become a religious endeavor. And we tend to see soldiers as religious actors and their acts of war as objects of devotion or actions of devotion to God. In that context, and again here we see a contrast with just war theory, war tends to be fought without limit. It may actually seek the total destruction of the enemy, both its combatants and its non-combatants. Or at least it would tend to see that anything one must do to win is justified. After all, you are fighting for God in the name of absolute good over against the enemies of God and absolute evil. Anything you can do to defeat absolute evil should be done. You should be aware that the Crusade tradition does have roots in the Bible, in both the Old and the New Testaments. I have said that a part of the reason we have these various traditions of Christian reflection on war is because the Bible does not offer a clear perspective. I've also suggested that just war theory isn't found in Scripture, though clearly it points to certain passages as a foundation for just war theory. The Crusade tradition has a clear biblical basis, certainly in the Old Testament conception of harem or holy war. We often hear about jihad as a concept within the Quran and in Islam, but you should be aware that in the Hebrew Bible, in the Old Testament, there is a similar concept of holy war, The Hebrew word is Hurim. So we will not look here at specific passages, but I have provided you links to the passages in the Old Testament from the book of Joshua that refer to holy war fought on behalf of God, where the total destruction of the Canaanites, their soldiers and their civilians and their cattle, was commanded by God. The Crusade tradition also has some roots in the New Testament. There is apocalyptic literature in both the Old and the New Testament, Daniel in the Old Testament and Revelation in the New, where the end of history is imagined, and the end of history as a conclusion to a cosmic and historical battle between the forces of good and the forces of evil, between the forces of God and the forces of false gods. That apocalyptic literature employs a great deal of violent imagery, warlike imagery, as it proclaims the ultimate victory of God over the forces of evil, and tends to support, therefore, this crusading perspective. We have seen that pacifists see themselves as called upon to bear witness to the biblical hope for peace. Just warriors intend peace on the other side of war, and that goal of greater justice and greater peace within history is a significant part of just war theory. Peace also plays a role, ironically, within the Crusade tradition. But from the perspective of the Crusade tradition, peace is possible only when evil has been destroyed, only when the enemies of God have been destroyed. So the Crusade tradition, too, acknowledges and recognizes and affirms and seeks the biblical ideal of peace. But from its perspective, that peace is possible only when the enemies of God have been destroyed by those who serve God. Not only does the Crusade tradition have biblical roots, there is an historical period in the early Middle Ages when the Crusade tradition shaped very much the behavior of Christian people and of nations or empires that thought of themselves as Christian. So what President Obama was referring to in his prayer breakfast address was a history of several campaigns by the Christian nations of Europe to reconquer or to conquer the Holy Land, which had come under the control and the possession of Islamic rulers. And so the Crusades were campaigns authorized by the Pope of the Vatican, the authorities of the Roman Catholic Church, and by the civil authorities of many of the European nations for the purpose of retaking the Holy Land from Muslim rulers. And along the way, great religiously motivated violence and destruction and death was the result. Now, as I've said, almost no one defends the Crusade tradition today. And yet I think it's important to recognize what I would call crusading tendencies. And I'm particularly thinking about that in reference to aspects of our American context. Way back in the section on a Christian worldview, I referred to the idea that many folks have had throughout our history that the United States has unique theological significance, some going so far as seeing us as God's new chosen people, God's new Israel. The secular phrase for that common today is the idea of American exceptionalism, that we are unlike any nation in the world. Now, what I want to point out is that to the degree people in the United States see us as having a unique theological significance, see our nation as somehow uniquely related to God and grounded in divine values or divine truth. To the degree we see ourselves that way, there's a tendency to see our wars always as wars in which good, or we represent the forces of good, we are under the authority of God and devoted to God, and our enemies, therefore, are God's enemies. There's another important influence in religious thinking in the United States that supports and creates a tendency toward a crusading perspective, and that is what's called Christian millennialism. Millennialism refers to the biblical theme of a 1,000-year reign of God at the end of history, thus the millennialism. Millennialism has been important in American religious history since the middle of the 19th century, and maybe a bit earlier, and continues to have influence today. You may have heard of the Left Behind series, and the whole idea that history is about to come to an end, that God is about to intervene, and that the faithful of God will be raptured or lifted up, and the enemies of God will be destroyed. That sort of thinking has become particularly important again with the creation of the nation of Israel in 1948, which many American Christians have seen as a fulfillment of biblical prophecy. Again, without commenting on the validity of Christian millennialism, I simply want to point out that idea that history is coming to an end, that God is about to triumph in human history, supports or can lead to a crusading tendency in the way that folks think about war. Now, all this is relevant to the war on terrorism for a couple of reasons. First, you might be aware that in the days immediately after September 11th, President Bush at the time referred to our struggle against Islamic terrorism as a crusade. Now, he very quickly stopped using that language, and even when he used it, was quite emphatic in saying that our struggle against international terrorism, even that terrorism motivated somehow out of Islamic faith, was not a war against Islam. And yet, there are those among us who see it that way. And there is a tendency, particularly given the fact that brutal terrorist acts continue to be committed by folk who claim a justification and motivation within their Islamic faith, there surely is a tendency to interpret the war on terrorism as a kind of religious or holy war between one nation who has a unique relationship to God as Christianity understands him, against forces that claim Islam as their inspiration. Now, having said that this tendency exists, I don't think there's evidence that the United States has therefore seen itself as justified in waging the war on terrorism without limit. Though surely for those that see this war as a kind of religious war, there is a tendency to see almost anything that the United States might do to win it. Later we'll talk about torture as an example. That anything we might do could be justified because we're fighting for God against the enemies of God. So this crusade tradition is important to recognize, and its ongoing influence is important to recognize, even though, as I've said, almost no scholar or theologian defends it.